Spring is finally on its way. All my seedlings are ready and growing on the windowsill, and at this time of year I really like to just spruce up little things around the house, maybe change the decor slightly. And this year what I'm trying to do is just use up things which otherwise would go in the bin. And I've had this demijohn sitting in the pantry for over a year. I knew I wanted to use it, and I also wanted to use up all the paint that I had around the house from painting the bedrooms, painting furniture, and there was this paint in particular that, as you can see, has gone quite stodgy and very dry, which normally would be a pain in the neck, but in this case it's perfect because I really want to try and get a very interesting texture on this demijohn. So I'm going to use the demijohn, make sure it's all clean and there's no dust on it or anything like that. Then I'm going to be using a paintbrush, and very roughly, this does not need to be neat. You don't even need to move the paintbrush in one direction. Move it in multiple directions. It will make it a lot more interesting later. And also try and apply it quite heavily. If you have a paint that you want to use and it's not as thick and clayish as this, what you can do is you can add either baking powder or bicarb into that, and that will give it more of a matte effect as well. I was going to do that, but I want to do that later on in the year, maybe for a Christmas themed one, or maybe even on my dressing table as well, because I do want something pretty in the bedroom that I can just routinely change out. But for the moment, this is what I've got, so that is what I'm going to use. And like I mentioned, I'm just going to run this paintbrush in all different directions. There are two other things you could do here. If you've got a paintbrush that is completely and utterly destroyed, and I think anyone who has paintbrushes and paints regularly always has that one brush which has been dropped on the floor too many times. Maybe you accidentally left paint to dry in it, so the bottom's all stiff and then the top just splays out in all different directions. Use that, because that will create an absolutely fascinating texture. And alternatively, if you don't have that, take newspaper or any junk mail, scrunch that up and then try and go over it afterwards with that and stipple it on. It will create a very, very interesting texture. Now for the next part, I want to use up some of this gold foil that I've had. If you've been watching my videos from the from the Claire de Lys art days, you know that I use this on my 7 Deadly Sins series and on a few other ones as well. So I've had it for a while and it needs to just get used up. I've realized that there are so many art supplies that I have that I've had for 6-7 years. They just need to be used up. So I'm going to be using both of these. I liked the colour of both of them, but I thought they would be more interesting if I mix them together, so that is what I'm going to do. But before I use those, I'm going to start applying another coat of paint. Now I have this colour which originally I used to paint our wardrobes, and this one's interesting because the previous colour is quite matte, and this one, while it isn't shiny, it's not completely matte either. So I'm going to be taking a sponge and I'm going to be stippling that on top. The trick with this is to do it lightly and quickly. If you do it quickly, there's going to be more paint left on the sponge and it's going to kind of bobble up on the surface of the demijohn. Because these colours are so similar, obviously I don't want to cover up what's underneath it, and it can be quite hard to do that if you're too meticulous. You have to be very quick and just stipple it on and then move on. And there's going to be other things layered on afterwards, so you don't have to worry about creating an interesting texture too much at this point. Once I've used that second colour, I'm going to be using a slightly darker colour. I think this one was called Wheat Corn. I can't remember exactly, but it's one of the colours that I used in the house to paint the wall, and eventually I want to use it to make a marbled effect. But long story short, I have far too much of this. Doesn't matter if I use it to paint an entire other room, there's just far too much paint and I don't want it to go to waste, so I'm going to be using this. Again, I'm going to be stippling that on the page, making sure that I'm happy with the amount of paint that I have on the sponge, and then slowly working my way around the demijohn. A few times I switched in between the colours. They're so similar in shade, it doesn't really matter. I wanted to make sure that I had a nice gradient, and because they are so similar, it's not like they were going to create an unusual colour combination. It's not really noticeable, and if anything, once I jump in between those two shades, they blend really nicely together, so that wasn't an issue. And this is the part that I was very excited for. I wanted to use up some of my plaster of Paris. I've still got a fair amount of it left over from a previous project, and contrary to popular belief, that can actually go off and not work properly. I have accidentally used some plaster of Paris that was just far too old, and it basically turns to weird crumbly sand. So I'm trying to use up all the supplies that I can't see myself finishing anytime soon. I can't really give you an accurate ratio for this because, as with most things, I tend to just eyeball it and then adjust it as it goes, but it's plaster of Paris with a bit of wood glue and then some water until I get the kind of consistency that I want, which is thick and moldable, I guess is the best way to describe it. For some parts of this, I'll be using a nail art brush for the top of the demijohn where I want to create a root pattern, and then on the bottom of the demijohn I'm going to be using a spatula. You can use whatever you prefer. You could even use your fingers if that's something you want to try, though bear in mind that with wood glue, while generally it's fine to get that on your skin, if you've got unusual allergies like I do, you might not want to use your fingers. Just check the ingredients, and when in doubt, wear gloves. It's not the end of the world to just put on a pair of gloves or use a tool that works better for you. You don't have to use a paintbrush. You could use a sponge if you want to try. Another interesting effect that you can do, which I will show you in a future video, is using a spoon, and then you layer them on top, and it can create a petal-like effect, and you can create some really beautiful patterns, but I'll have to save that for another video. For today, all I want to do is create that root pattern and then move on to the bottom of the demijohn where I'm going to be using a spatula and roughly create a raised layered texture. And now for the gold foil. It would probably have been a lot neater if I'd done this and mixed it in a bowl, but to be perfectly honest, I don't mind the mess, I quite enjoy it. So I just poured it out on the table, mixed them together, and then to apply it, you're going to need some kind of glue. You could even use PVA glue if you want, but I'm going to be using some wood glue which has been mixed in water just to water it down and make it easier to apply. I'll paint the area that I want the gold foil to stick to, and then for actually putting the gold foil down, you could use your fingers, but the danger is that you can get the glue on your fingers and then it just becomes a very sparkly mess. Trust me on this one. What you ideally want to get is some kind of brush which has a very similar effect to that of a blush brush. So where the fibers splay out a little bit, they pick things up very lightly, but it's got enough of that firmness to be able to work a colour into your skin, or in this case to get the foil to adhere to it and then bounce it onto the surface. That's ideally what's going to work. So if you have an old brush which has maybe been damaged and you're not going to get too upset if it does get damaged, go ahead and use that, though because it is wood glue, provided you wash it fast enough after you've finished applying the foil, it should be fine and should recover nicely. But just in case, I used an old blush brush which got completely trashed. I know it probably doesn't look it in the video. At the moment, that brush is basically being held with a combination of just hope and an awful lot of super glue, so it needs to be used on a project like this. It can't really be used for my face anymore. And this is how the foil looks once it's been applied. To make the root pattern on the top of the demijohn, now that that's dried, I want it to stand out a bit more, so I'm going to use a spray bottle, some brown ink and some water, mix the two together and then spray that all over the top. I could leave it at that, but I want to add more detail, a little bit like what I did with the mirror in the hallway. I did a video about that a few months ago, showing how I took the original gold frame, painted it with white paint, but then I wanted to make the edges stand out and look interesting. I didn't just want something which had been gold and painted white up on the wall. It needs to have a little bit more interesting details to it, and that's what I wanted to do with the root pattern on the top. So I got some water, some paint brushes, put the water over the root so that it would make the colour go into all the crevices. There's no point trying to be as detailed as what nature will just do naturally. I just wanted to wet the roots, and then I move that ink into the edges, make sure that it's blended either using my fingers or using a piece of tissue to soak up any of the ink that I don't want to be there. And then I'm going to take some of that white paint, the original white paint that I used, and put it on all the highlights for the roots so that there's even more contrast. thing to do now is add the string. I'm going to add some brown string, just the kind that you would get in a garden centre for the garden. Wrap that around the middle of the demijohn, or at least from the handle up. And then where the root pattern is, that little space in between the root pattern and the glass, I'm going to be adding some black cord. You could go ahead and use some normal garden twine like what I've used on the top, but I don't want everything to look the same. Now that that's all finished, I need to clean the shelf, which has just become a dumping ground for everything else, and actually put a nice display on it. I had some of the Honesty saved from Christmas for this, and while I don't think I'm going to leave it sat the way it currently is, for the moment I just want all the pretty things that I regularly want in the living room laid out nicely so that it can stop holding all the toy cars and all the random junk that I just haven't put away. And that's it, I'm done. Well, for now anyway. If you like my content and want to follow me on Patreon, that's where you can find my early content, extra content, and see the thought process behind things like my books, cover designs, videos, and artwork. You can also find me on Instagram, but the best place to follow me and make sure that all my new content is sent directly to you is through my website and the mailing list. On the top right hand corner, you put your name, the email you want your new content to be sent to, and that's it. You're done.